English is the biggest language in the world today, but did you know it almost didn't make it? In fact, the language that you speak today and take for granted almost became a different language altogether. This story of where English came from is going to give you dinner party material for the next 10 years, so listen up.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
English is a West Germanic language, and the word English even comes from one of the ancient Germanic peoples that migrated to the island of Great Britain. They were the Angles, a West Germanic tribe, and speakers of English are called Anglophones. English is, of course, the main language of the UK, Ireland, the USA, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and more, and it's used and spoken across the globe by 1.5 billion people. In fact, English is the official language of 67 countries, and if you're watching this, I'm counting you.
Gislos estine boton agnoton, estintini tirus ferisnispe.
The very first speakers of English lived in early medieval England, but English didn't entirely originate in England, and the real story begins way earlier. In the late Bronze Age, inhabitants of the British Isles spoke the ancestral language called Common Brittonic or Brittonic, and this is the language that Julius Caesar found them speaking when he invaded in 55 BC, a near disaster that lasted only 3 weeks. Between the clever Celts and the British weather, his plan failed, but the Romans wrote that the language that they'd heard sounded similar to Gaulish. Interesting. Sometime later, in 43 AD, the Romans invaded again, beginning Roman rule of Britain. This time they stayed for nearly 400 years, and the new culture of the Isles was Roman British. So if you ever wondered why most of our words have Latin roots, well, there is your answer. But as you may know, the Romans always met their match in the end.
Once the Roman Empire fell, Roman Britain was left to fend for itself. Almost immediately, invaders started raiding towns and villages across the country.
More specifically, these new invaders, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, came from northern Germany and Denmark. They drove the native Britons west and north into what is now Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Now, the Jutes settled in Kent, the Saxons settled in southwest England, and the Angles took the rest of the country, including Scotland. Each tribe kept their own land and their own dialect, but it was the Angles who dominated the land, and their language helped create the name England, which represented a country of 3 tribes. Now, do you have any idea where English got its names for the days of the week? I bet you're only going to get part of this right, but if you have an idea, let me know in the comments. So time went by and the tribal languages became Old English, and people who spoke it, we call them the Anglo-Saxons. But even if English is your native language, you would have great difficulty understanding Old English today. What do you think? Does it look hard? Well, when the very first Old English writing appeared, more texts were written in the West Saxon dialect. They had some strange letters, but we'll come back to that a bit later. There was something else that played a huge role in getting people literate: British Latin. See, because of the Roman occupation, many new words entered English, although there wasn't a spelling standard yet, so you could spell words any which way you wanted to. In fact, spelling could give away which part of the country you were from, and this is how England ended up with 4 major dialects. From this era up to the 10th century, we have authors who gave us lots of great literature, fascinating poems that tell stories of heroic journeys and wild battles. In fact, I dare you to confess if you've never heard of this one.
Huatwe jar denum en jar dagum, theud kuninga, thrimje frunan, Hutha Athalingus Ellen Fremidon.
Even if you can't quite make sense of the language yet, can you hear how it's starting to sound vaguely English? It's very cool. Beowulf is a story of a fierce struggle between the hero and a bloodthirsty monster called Grendel, and it's the longest epic poem that exists in Old English, the only one that survived at least, and it has about 3,000 words that you won't even recognize today. As for the grammar, well, Old English had 3 grammatical genders. It had 4 case endings. In fact, it was a lot closer to German than to modern English. Here's a longer text, like if you want to pause this and have a look at it. In the final phase, late Old English, something dark was coming. It was the thing that would change the language forever. Immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. This is what the Anglo-Saxons wrote about the day that the Vikings attacked England at Lindisfarne in 793. I guess it was a bad day, but things kept getting worse. The real nightmare began in 865 AD. New Vikings battled the West Saxons and killed their king. His brother Alfred the Great took his place, called a truce with the Vikings, and named their language English. Alfred was a king who loved poetry and believed in education, and he had many great Latin books translated into English so that people could read them. Nice guy. He was also one of the first English writers, and he wrote about what he called the Anglesin, the race of the English. But the invasions from Scandinavia were not over. They kept on coming until the 11th century. So it's not surprising that eventually English speakers and Vikings understood each other's languages. And this is how English got saturated with words from Old Norse. What's really funny is that it was the Norsemen who caused English to lose its inflectional endings because they couldn't pronounce various endings of English words. Now, earlier I asked you about the names for days of the week. If you placed your bet on the Romans, well, you're only partially right.
Saturn Day, Sunday, and Moon Day are the Roman planetary gods. But Tuesday, Woden's or Odin's Day, Thor's Day, and Freya's Day all came from the Germanic and Scandinavian cultures.
Well, there you go. It was also the Vikings, but they weren't the last kind of invader to ravage England. Oh no. But let's catch our breath for a moment and see how English writing was coming along. If you're enjoying this video, by the way, show your love by clicking like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel, and YouTube will then be more likely to show you the sequel to this video, which you will not want to miss. Want to hear the first English sentence ever written down? Here goes. This she-wolf is a reward to my kinsman. It's a runic inscription on a gold medallion that was found in Suffolk. Yet before we had the Latin alphabet, we wrote with runes. These were Anglo-Saxon runes, and the alphabet had between 26 and 33 letters. Later, some Irish missionaries introduced a type of Latin script called half-uncial, which was easier to read and write. There were a few more changes, and spelling came closer to Old French spelling. That's why we write queen now, for example, instead of this. The next alphabet we had was the Old English Latin alphabet, which had 24 letters and took us into the 12th century. Most of the letters were taken straight from Latin, but some Old English sounds didn't have an equivalent Roman letter. So these two here were modified Latin letters, and these two came from the runic alphabet. They didn't use Q and Z except for in foreign names, and K was optional. Look how cool this is. But that's not all. Old English had a funny kind of shorthand called Tironian notes, although it disappeared eventually because it was associated with witchcraft, but that is a story for another day.
In the year 1066, 7,000 Norman infantry and knights sailed in warships across the English Channel. Their target, England, home to more than 1 million people. And around the same period of time, other groups of Normans were setting forth all across Europe, going on adventures that would reverberate throughout that continent's history.
The Normans were descendants of the Vikings who had already invaded France, and so they had curious ancestry, and they spoke a French dialect. Now, one night, led by William the Conqueror, they came across the English Channel, and Old English was about to take a dramatic turn. Legend says the English King Harold was killed by an arrow to the eye. The tribes started splitting, and with Norman kings ruling for the next 300 years, Old French and Latin really kicked English in the teeth. Suddenly, all the fancy people spoke French, and the scholars and church people spoke Latin. English dropped to a third language that commoners spoke, and the amount of dialects was just ridiculous. You taking notes here?
Words that have SK sounds in Swedish developed an SH sound in English. There are still some English words with SK, like skirt and skull, but they're direct borrowings from Old Norse that came after the SK to SH shift.
Ever wondered why English often has totally different words for the same thing? Well, the Anglo-Saxons were hunters and farmers, so it made sense that animal words came from them. But the upper-class French gave us culinary terms like boeuf. It happened with other kinds of words too, like want versus desire. In fact, Norman French introduced more than 10,000 words into English. Next thing, English word order changed from subject, object, verb to subject, verb, object. It was a time of enormous grammar changes in English, new pronouns, new verb constructions, even pronunciation was changing. As if all this wasn't enough, in the 12th century, a boatload of words arrived from central France. And, we all complain about languages being so hard to learn, but back in the day, it was really common for professionals to be trilingual and speak 3 languages on a regular basis.
Under the young sunna hath in the ram is have a coseruna.
In the 14th century, English became dominant in Britain again, chock full of French, Latin, and Scandinavian words, but still English. A writer called Chaucer, you may have heard of him, was so popular that the way that he used English was more or less approved as the right way to do it. No joke, writing is powerful stuff, remember that. Chaucer mainly wrote in a London dialect of late Middle English, and one of his most famous works is the Canterbury Tales. Take a look, can you work this out? Until now, school kids had been learning Latin, but in 1348, English became the new language in most schools, and in 1362 they enforced English in the courts with the Statute of Pleading. No French, no Latin, only English. There was an explosion of interest in English writing, and people would write whatever dialect they spoke. They had these storytelling contests. This is very cool. Storytelling was the main entertainment of the day, and the winner got a crown and a free dinner. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but the way I see it, if those people loved stories so much and were easily trilingual, obviously stories and languages go together, like tequila and lime or tea and biscuits. And if you don't believe me, you might like to take a look at the way we teach languages here at StoryLearning. It's called the StoryLearning method for a reason. It's because we teach languages through stories. You can learn a new language very effectively this way, and it will feel like a big breath of fresh air from what you might remember learning at school. If you're curious, have a look in the video description. You'll see a link to my free StoryLearning kit. It's a bunch of goodies that show you exactly how this method works and how you can learn a new language, Spanish, Japanese, French, even Latin with stories. It's totally free, so check it out. Now, back to it. By the year 1400, London was the biggest city in England, and the way people spoke was changing rapidly. Explorers and traders brought beautiful new words from Spanish, Arabic, Italian, Turkish. During the mid-1400s, they introduced a standard called Chancery English. Now, the story goes that the clerks working for the Chancery in London spoke fluent Latin and French, and it was their job to prepare the court documents. So they had a huge influence on how English was actually used, and their dialect sounded more like how we speak today.
Sithen the sage and the Assot was saced at Troy, the Borg Britned and Brent to Brondus and Ascus. The tulk that the Tromus of Trazen there wrought was treated for his treachery, the truest on earthe.
Go on, tell us how much you understood. This is the versioncy of the language used for roughly 300 years. By now, no one was using runes to write anymore, although when runes started fading out, not everyone was happy about it, and they tried to keep them going. There is a poem called the Old English Rune Poem, and each stanza is a riddle to which the name of the rune is the solution. Isn't that cool? Today, what do we have? TikTok? There was this writer called Thomas Malory who loved stories of King Arthur and Sir Lancelot, and he wrote a book in prison with a French title, Le Mort d'Arthur. Why he was in prison makes for a very long reading list, but between prison escapes, he changed English. How about that? See, instead of writing in the usual formal style, Malory decided to write this epic story in his own words, and what do you know? It became the world's first printed bestseller. By the time Henry VIII was King of England, the commoners could finally read in a language they understood, and the common dialect spread like wildfire.
Plaideth rhymed with dreadeth, are with are, and own with alone. You find craters, raisins, you get play and pray and say. But then thee rhymes with say. So wait, were all of these actually e? Or maybe thee was they?
What is going on? Well, it was the late 15th century, and something strange started happening with the way that people pronounced their vowels, and so began something called the Great Vowel Shift. It was going to have a profound effect on English. You know those pure vowel sounds that many continental languages have? English lost them, and this is how early modern English began. Around the same time, the printing press was invented, which made it super easy for common English to become mainstream. It also meant that they could standardize spelling, punctuation, and grammar, so no more spelling a word any old way that you wanted. So which dialect do you think became the standard one? It was the dialect of London, of course. That's where most publishing houses were. Books became cheaper and more people learned to read. They printed and distributed the Bible, and the English language grew very, very important. But someone else was about to take the world by storm. Who could it be?
The oppressor's wrong. The poor man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that Patian merit the unworthy takes when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin.
If you were looking for Shakespeare, well, you found him. The stage was set for the great actor and playwright who'd bring us 39 dramatic works in a whole new kind of English. It still wasn't quite the Queen's English, at least as we know it.
Who was your father?
My father was King Henry.
Henry?
Yes, I'm King Henry VIII's daughter.
You mean daughter?
Yes, daughter.
They say Elizabeth I spoke 5 languages fluently by age 11, and eventually she was quite the polyglot. Now, English had been going through a bit of its own drama. It was in contact with all sorts of other languages because of things like war and colonization. When the Renaissance from Europe hit England, suddenly English was also picking up Greek words and a whole bunch of new Latin root words. English was basically swimming in different dialects and accents again. It was quite a mess. Anyway, Will Shakespeare and his mates found it frustratingly hard to express themselves using normal English, so they got creative. They stole and modified words from other languages. I can just see them having a laugh about this at one of their merry meetings at the Mermaid Tavern. But he also came up with other words that never quite caught on. Probably just as well, huh? Altogether, Shakespeare invented about 1,700 words that we still use. In 1604, the first English dictionary was published. Dictionaries. Remember them? The Table Alphabetical. How's that for a name? But it was going to take a long time for them to settle on a dictionary that everyone was happy with. And there's a real cracker coming up. Have you ever noticed that English doesn't have an academy like so many other countries and languages do? Well, it's not like they didn't try. In 1662, they set up a committee like the French Académie Française with the idea to improve English, but it didn't work. Later on in 1712, a guy called Jonathan Swift tried again, but he failed too. English, you see, had plans of its own. The grammarians started writing books of rules for English. Meanwhile, England had come through chaos with the Civil War, and war gets people emotional, so the rise of poetry and philosophical writing began. In 1755, an absolute legend, a guy, very witty, wrote an enormous English dictionary that sorted out the unruly mess that was spelling and grammar. You've got to see some of these entries, they are brilliant. He deliberately left out most francophone words, which he hated. To this day, English still has no formal academy. We probably need one, but we don't want to start a war. If you think English was done with new vocabulary, well, think again. First, the Industrial Revolution happened. Suddenly there were all these new concepts in science and technology that we needed words for, and the scientists and scholars chose to invent them using Greek and Latin roots. Well, why not, right? They were there. Second, by 1922, the British Empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface, and that has a lot of new influence on the English language. Now, throw in all the other trading and imperial nations that came along, it's no wonder we ended up with hundreds of dialects. Today, every subculture of English has its own nuances of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Did you know that many Americanisms were originally British, preserved in the colonies but lost in Britain? And that's a whole other story waiting to be told. Now, in case you somehow didn't ever catch this, the 26 letters you write with in English are the Roman or Latin alphabet, and the word alphabet comes from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. As for English spelling, one of the most frustrating things is that words with the same vowel structure don't always rhyme. You can get 7 ways just to spell the sound E. Watch and listen. He believed Caesar could see people seizing the seas. You see, that's kind of crazy. As if that wasn't bad enough, there are nouns and verbs that are spelled the same but pronounced completely differently. And did I mention contronyms? Well, this is good. Contronyms have 2 meanings that are complete opposites. Bottom line, English spelling is hard, but it's also fascinating and tells a story, and I'm pretty sure you get it after the mad history you've just heard. The best part about English is its mind-blowing usefulness. No other language comes close to being so widely understood. No matter what your accent or even your dialect is, you can make yourself understood by pretty much anyone else who speaks English, even if it's not their first language, which is pretty cool. And if you want to test your English listening skills, there is a super fun challenge waiting in the next video, right over here.